started because I want to keep us moving. We're hoping to give you guys some time again today to get into profiles like we talked about. So I just want to give you some updates going back to some of the things that we talked about, and I have a lot to share with you, but we'll keep this on there until we get them addressed. So we still want to hold that at lunchtime. I think we've now heard from all of the hosts, and I'm back to working with our admin team just to confirm, and I think it's going to be even for both of them. So one quick thought is, do you guys have a preference? And it's not that I can necessarily guarantee it, if all things else are equal, is Monday or Tuesday. So Monday, well, I think your exams start Wednesday night, so you're still in. If it's better than the other. We were, but nothing's changed. Okay. All right. So the forum, I think Robin and I came to a resolution today that we're not going to stress about the forum because it has been such a pain, and I'm still trying to work with our support, and they haven't. We have something for when you're here in the summer, and we're going to keep posting discussion questions, but I think for the most part we'd even address those discussion questions in class and conversation. I think having that communication forum and reflection opportunity will be more important when you're totally immersed in the program and you're doing both your internship and your community engagement piece for a week as opposed to an hour and a half every week. So don't worry about it. We'll keep discussion questions going so you're thoughtful about it, but we're not going to stress about it. I checked back in today, and they still have not heard anything from admin contacts. So worry, you will get your stipend, but I just don't know the details yet, so we'll keep that up there. Internship conversations with hosts. Robin and I talked about that today, and it may be that the logistical detail aspect of it, so attire, anything else you need to know in advance of Garrett, we can handle it via email or a phone conversation. We'll get back to you on this, but we'll use that community engagement conversation. The community engagement conversation, we think, makes sense to have that over lunch, and that's the way we're thinking now, and we'll just, again, as we get closer, confirm. You know, we've had that discussion, and part of it is that we just don't want to be bombarding the hosts all the way through, so if we were to tell you now, call them up and talk to them about a couple of logistical details before it's all over. We might have more, we might have a few more, we might have a few more, so we're just going to hold off on that. What I was saying, Kevin, is we're asking last week about when do we start to engage the with all of these questions and that kind of thing. And what Robin and I talked about was logistical details. It'll make sense as we get closer to sending email or have a phone conversation. But that community engagement conversation is more, I think, of an informal kind of thing. And as you start to get to know your host over that lunch, that's going to be, I think it's also provides you with a little bit of somebody sitting person for an hour, something to talk about, right? So I think you'll do find that anyway, but it'll just be a way to get into it. And Saul, you asked last week about the community engagement component involving friends, and that too. And I think I think we're open to it. It'll become more clear next week when we talk about the details of that. So I think there'll be some times that it's appropriate and sometimes where it probably doesn't make sense. But we're open. Okay. So do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, if you were traipsing around successful, requiring by yourself, you're not talking to anybody. But if you're interviewing people and you're,
Just a reminder of where we are. This is hopefully not, here we go again, but just, you know what we've done over the last few weeks was last week focusing on the personal logistics and professional context. Just because Robin wasn't here last week, does anybody want to share anything that you gained through that class or anything that was Christian too? Conversation or helpful or not helpful or later? Was there anything that was raised that you think, oh gosh, I do need to find out more about this, or hadn't thought about it later? So I'm thinking that for Brian and Brian, if they were here, would say, okay, we want to get the housing issue resolved, but that wasn't so much of an issue for everybody else, I think.
I think for Brian, Syracuse, Brian also transportation.
Yes, we talked about that too. Okay, anything related to state office protocol or anything like that? Okay, so what we want to start moving in, we mentioned this briefly during the first session that we would be using this model that talks about rural community development to kind of guide the internship program. So we're really going to dive into that this week. We're going to talk about, to set the stage, I want to go back and visit a couple of definitions that we talked about 2 weeks ago, and then the framework, just here's what it's about. And then I want to have you apply that framework for just a quick second, give some thought to your own communities that you've spent the most time in so far. So, where, I don't know if it's born or whatever, but before coming to college where you spent all the time. I'm going to mention a couple of points for further reading, and then again, we want to leave hopefully at least a half hour, if not more, for you to talk or to go back in and do a little bit more work on your profile. Okay.
Clear, clearly at the beginning of the class, why is this important, why are we covering that? Hopefully we're going to talk about it again. The community capital framework, as I said, is a tool for community development purposes, but is your tool for part of your community agency. It's going to provide your really focusing on this. So this is a tool you can use this summer.
Community capacity is the knowledge, skills, and resources that community members have and only use to where it is that they want to go in terms of their development goals. And we talked about those goals in terms of ecological, social, and economic goals. So the community capitals framework, as you will see, is a way to frame or think about those resources, and I would even say skills, your knowledge and understanding of what you have in your area. Sure, please.
So that's the context that we're working in, community capacity.
Come closer to the mic.
So community capacity, community incorporates a lot of different things, but from your perspective and your community agency, we're working on attracting young professionals. So this is one of the resources, and this is one of the community development and community capacity that we're focusing on. So it's a very, very broad area. We can incorporate a lot of things, but again, try to bring it back to what is your piece of this puzzle? What is your part in the project?
So, and when we're talking about that capacity and those goals, we're thinking about it in terms of long-term viability of a community, and again, the social aspects of it, which I kind of outlined in red, the economic aspects of it, and then the ecological aspects of it. So, the capacity for long-term community sustainability. And then I think, again, the big piece, particularly from the perspective of the internship program and what you guys have been thinking about over the last couple of weeks, is that place, that this is all place-based and place matters, because everybody has resources, but those resources are different and unique to each of our spaces, our places. So we've talked about capacity, equity, and sustainability. There's been a couple of different ways that people have looked at this over the course of time and thinking about it based on the way, from a logical perspective, things have evolved. So in the beginning, we thought more about economy, and environment, and society, the social, political, and environmental, our social, economic, piece being separate and connected, that we could invest in one or invest in the other, but, everything was happening and it didn't much. We started thinking that, when one starts to impact the other, that they are really connected, and we have to be thoughtful, because what we don't invest in one impacts the other as much as what we do invest in the other. And then the third model, I really like this nested view, because it starts to get at the point that every view is kind of nested or based on the foundation of everything is our ecological, basis. If we can take care of the environment, we can't do anything else. And then we relate to each other. And then our development goals with, and they mentioned economy, but I would make the argument that there's lots of other development perspectives from development there.
And so I would too say that, you know, a lever, if you're making a shift or a policy that affects the economy, it may have a positive effect on the environment or society, but it also has negative or unpleasant too. They're not a positive shift. It's not having positive shifts necessarily elsewhere. So, art is in our perspective.
Good point. So, a way that these researchers, so this is starting to get into the model, but the way these researchers have started to think about this is using this model. And it doesn't, I would say it really goes back to that nested view in relation, but it kind of places these on equal footing, and I would say teases out the social aspects of that other model, if that makes sense. But their whole point was this image that we have, is what they're trying to illustrate, is this idea that having a vital economy, having a social system, and having a healthy ecosystem all depend on equal investment across these areas. If you don't pay attention to all of them, something's going to suffer. So you we're maybe primarily focused on investing in economic development, but I would say that if you talk to communities and when they're talking about how they're going to allocate their funds, you hear economic development, and their is that based on the research they've done, if people are focused really primarily on economic development, it's been to the detriment of others if they haven't invested equally in all of them. So this is what we're talking about.
I would say point out another obvious thing that I thought of it. Investing, it doesn't necessarily mean monetary investment.
To clarify that.
$9,000 in each pot.
Yeah.
It means intention, effort, attention, etc.
I think I mentioned it before, but Niels Flora was actually a graduate of what was the sociology department, the development sociology department now at Cornell. They've done this research both domestically and internationally, focused primarily on rural communities, although I think that it's probably pretty applicable across communities of different sizes. Doing it, they wanted to understand what were some of the characteristics of communities that seemed to thrive over a longer period of time, so they weren't so much more like this, but they were on a more even scale and really seemed to be vibrant, at least for a good portion of that time. Just go on. And I think the key point to make by bringing back this thing of capacity building is that all capitals are changing, right? So if we think of capacity building as a process, people are always changing, they're gaining new information, learning new skills, getting new knowledge, they're investing that back in those capital areas, they're interacting with them in different ways, which starts to all again. So to understand that this is dynamic, it's not a static kind of thing. Delve a little bit into each of the of this. So the first one we'll start with is just natural capital and thinking about that model and that everything rests on this. So I think it's really intuitive when you think about natural capital. What are listed some of those up there, but what could be other examples of natural capital based on that? In this part, remember how we defined place and what were some of the statistics of an area?
So we could think about, maybe we could think about the specific area as examples too. You can have an opportunity to think of another, your own community.
Yeah.
Okay, from the natural capital.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Forests.
Okay. Fairly, we have streams and rivers, but I think of, but I would even argue that air, basic are pretty important. Okay, so cultural capital is really about the way that people know their understanding of it and how they choose to act, or how they act within it. So it's what you experience in one area is going to be different. There's a cultural station and place that you're in that is informed part by the people who have moved into the area or originated in the area that has shaped it, right? So is it Americans that there? Are there different ethnic groups that have moved into the area? All that shaped the cultural aspect of it. Examples of cultural capital, we've listed a couple there. Can you think of any other things?
What is it that they have to offer in cultural capital? I don't really
Okay. When we looked at the demographic trends, I think one of the things that we looked at, didn't we look at speakers of the languages in an area? And that may be very different from even just outside where there's a strong influence or something like that, yeah. Just in terms of ethnic or racial diversity, but also age diversity. So, again, when we talk about older populations or younger populations, that influences the cultural aspect. A big key part of it is not only that there's lots, I think they would argue that you're tuning to cultural capital, you're open to this diversity as opposed to
to underscore it, as far as working through all these different capitals, think about how this contributes to the vibrancy of the community that was set. Would it be like, what does this bring to the richness, the fabric, the capacity of the community to be whole?
It's a really nice way to even think the overall capital kind of grouping. Rod, the director of Carnegie, talked about the tapestry of Canada, and so you think of all of the ways that these different capitals are woven together, if that makes sense, or like that.
From the perspective of this internship program about attracting and retaining young educated professionals, that if one capital is missing, how attractive the communities than to attract and retain people like yourself. So if natural capital, if the place is very flat, I mean, just sort of, if you will, using the term loosely, but trying to say, maybe for some people it is, but to a lot of others, it may be lacking. There's just no richness. I want some like first, some of those great restaurants. I want different types of people. I don't want everybody to be the same. So.
It doesn't mean that some of those opportunities aren't there. It could be that the community is not taking advantage of the assets. And so I think part of
or showcasing right.
Part of what you guys will be thinking about, I think, is recognizing the community may not even see in and of itself from an outside perspective, and thinking about if it's not being highlighted or capitalized on, how could they take advantage of things that they're not necessarily seeing as resources. And you'll have us know, but when we go and ask you to apply this framework to your own community, what we often find is that people think about things in their own community that they've kind of taken for granted before and see them in new ways. And it's an interesting process. So the next capital is human capital. And I think this is exciting, but it's really about the skills, the abilities that we have in an area. So again, this goes when I think back to our, when we did profiles, but it's Are there educational opportunities, formal or informal, there to help develop the skills of folks? And you know, types of leadership styles. But the whole, I think, key part of this is that people are able to think outside of the box, and again, motivate and develop the resources in is part of that leadership aspect. But it's also the institutions that support that kind of thing and different types of training programs.
And also look at human capital in aggregate too. So what's the average educational attainment of the population? The percentage of the college more, or what percentage is not graduating high school? And that can give you an idea of the challenges facing a particular population if they have low levels of human capital. So measuring it with one way of educational attainment. What is that?
Thinking about the way that these things intersect, it's, you know, can a leader take into consideration the diversity of the community and skills across that diversity too? So it's contributing and thinking big about those assets. Okay. Social capital is really about people relate to one another, support each other at a community level. So this is going at the individual level, which is really, I think, in that leadership skill, you're working across the community, but it's what you possess as an individual. Where social capital is really about the connections among the people of the community, and they differentiate between a couple of different ones: bonding social capital and bridging social capital. So I gave you an example of what those are, but kind of aside, what do you think bonding social capital would be? Christian, what are you thinking? Okay,
Capital was like interpersonal relationships in the community and bridging the ability to outside the community to bring in resources.
I would a little bit differently, but you're right. Both capitals are bringing people together, but bonding is really around like a common and shared goal. I think of it as you are passionate about something and you're working towards something. So there's something that bonds you together with the other people that you're relating to. So being social capital is more like a formal network. So let me think of what would be a good example. Bridging capital is that you're part of a local government. So you job you do within that to serve your community, and you are bonded through that common type. You may, presumably if you're running for office, you have some passion about it, but it's really that kind of formal structure that links together, or maybe it's a church social group or a club or something like that. But what you do within that and how you relate to each other and join around something you're passionate about is kind of that bonding piece. Does that make sense?
Well, I would say something like LinkedIn.
I would say, yes, go ahead.
Okay, there's two people here. People-wise, they're the same, both have, but one person is a person home and the other one is really linked to network. And so that person has more social capital and is more connected. So one capital attribute is similar. The other person has been treated more to community through that process. So capital in the first person is sort of dormant without being kinetic energy, right? And put it back through other types of capital.
That's a great example. Remember that for the next time. What would you say would be stronger, knowing what we just talked about with the difference between bonding and bridging? Right. So, really, if you end up resigning from a board, life goes on and you move on. But when you really have those source of passion or whatever it is that you're working together and that you have these experiences together, that's something that even if you move on, you probably still hold on to pretty tightly in some way. Okay. Our political political capital is its ability to you hold power, you can influence regulations, rules, and they're enforced. But some political capital has to be an elected official by definition. Example of somebody else. Thinking about your own community again, or Ithaca. That's a great example. So it might be that the community wants to move forward or something. The elected officials have said, let's do this change. But the priest from on high, the congregation may or may not be in favor of that, right? So if the priest doesn't accept, people support it, and the board go ahead and we're going to do this, but there's nobody behind it, and it's probably going to flounder unless it has been approved essentially by that other with that power. Does that make sense? I think sometimes of maybe it's the mafia behind. You think of movies or something like that too. But capital. It tends to be that when we talk about capital, this is probably the easiest one for us to identify. This is actually a critique of this model, is that people feel like the word capital is too, the focus is on money and not think of it in different ways. So, but financial capital can be a variety of things, and one of the things that I often talk about or give an example of, how many of you are familiar with, there's a small community in Vermont which has a really strong local food system developed. One of the things that they did was somebody that wanted to create, they couldn't come up with a capital, and so what they did through conventional means, and so what they did was sold gift certificates for $50 and buy it, and we'll give you a gift certificate for $100, but you can't use it all at once in our first month. You have to spread it out over the course of time. And they actually funded the development of this restaurant doing that. So not only did they have them coming back using their $5 that they had that they could spend next month or 10 or whatever it was, but the additional stuff they brought friends, so they started building their clientele. So I typically think that we need all the time when we talk about development is how are we going to get the money to do it. But what I would really is that by taking a look again at all the different capitals, you can be thoughtful and creative about resources and thinking about how to pull them together. I can't remember. I will go back and look it up for you. You'd be actually with your project call, you'd be interested in that. I'll try to. I haven't heard any updates, but when it first started going, it was really innovative. So and I think lots of other things spun off. So it is really a great example of this. How do you put this together?
Another example for financial capital might be barter and exchange, and while that's more somewhat traditional in rural areas, it also takes place in house, there's or it's a money.
$50.
$50.
I would think of, I suppose, Obama's campaign as a really good example too, of the fact that we, again, often think that we have to go out and get those big donors to build up, financial or whatever, and in fact, lots and lots of people contributed so much money, and it was a huge source. So say that while we typically think about going out and getting that big donor or that big pot of gold, there's lots of ways to think about this.
Yeah, so you're looking at communities, and it's not just the banks. How many banks are there, but they tie back to social capital too. It's a network of people rallying around a cause, and you sell that sort of energy for a shared good, shared goal, could help them financial capital. So that's unique.
Built capital is, I think, another we are really more familiar with, and that's more common, although we don't necessarily hear it in those terms. I think maybe a little bit more so You may, even in some of the work that you're doing, Kevin, hear the term or the built environment a little bit more often, but it's really the infrastructure. And again, when people think of development, it's how do we get money to support economic development, and part of that is having the infrastructure that we need to do that. So do we have the energy needs to serve manufacturing might come into the area? Do we need that? I think certainly one of the big things we hear, really in rural areas, is do we have broadband? So talking about a global economy, how can we be competitive and have people living here if they can't access in a regular and ongoing way? So, yeah, it's really often the focus of community development efforts, and there's a broad array of kind of that infrastructure piece that's built capital. So those are those that the spend capitals, I think. Can you each of those, if we go back to that, that example, can you see each of them play out into the piece, the social piece, and then the ecosystem piece that was kind of there? I think from my perspective, the ecosystem's there, and again, we can impact it, but we can't create it, right? When I think about this. So ecosystem is really what we have, I would say, the most control over, and that's us. How do we relate to each other? So one of the things that I like about this model is it teases out social piece, the different ways we relate to each other. Political, social, I would say, falls under there. Financial to some extent, but cultural and human. And then I would say you get into the economy piece is kind of probably financial crosses both in the built capital, but I think it's a way for them to kind of tease that out and think about the different ways that you need to invest in communities from what they found. So, a couple of key things that I just want to mention before there or on to the next slide. I guess actually let's come to the next slide, and we'll have a breakout, and then we'll come back and summarize some of those key points. But you is each of you at your own community.
Community,
Yeah,
you
correct.
grew up in, or
Thinking about the community that you spent the most time in. Area. Got examples at the top of the chart. Community. Well, this week, in the last couple of weeks, speakers found out this thing. It might be happening at something with that. And the mic. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is, because there's something, we haven't seen that black thing pop up, so for whatever reason, even though it was showing up on the mic that it was recording, it must have without that. I don't understand why that would do that, but anyway, that's somebody, but I think that was the key for him. You want a little more info to that? I can stand we do that. So I think that if these things I think is interesting and Mary Kevin is things like crowdsourcing. Are you familiar with those? So there's also I think traditional lenders, but now there's a lot of opportunities for lenders so that you can go on and people invest some funds with private and get paid back as a anyway. I think that there's some of those newer things emerging. You may or may not have those in your community, but I would say that it's normal that you would struggle to find that because I think that the way we've thought about that has been pretty traditional. So
local philanthropic for the attention maybe based on their local on to develop projects.
find out. Let's go back to natural capital and that maybe make the area unique. So I'm guessing that we all have water and we all have rivers or lakes or streams. Is there anything you could say that the place that you live in has any sort of natural capital that might distinguish it from everything?
Is like one of the ledges.
Okay. Huh. Okay, that's really neat. Yeah.
So this isn't different from everywhere else, but in my area, the part that
That's a good point. I would like to Ithaca, I live a half hour south of here, and the lights here are getting brighter and brighter, and my star view isn't quite what it used to be, so I think that's a good point. Isn't it up here that we talked about that you didn't?
Those are, as you think about, well, how, if you were in the tourism industry or, again, trying to attract and bring people, hey, are you bird hunters, are you into birds, did you know that we, from those areas, will see birds over. These become characteristics and assets that you can showcase that it's not going to be important to everybody, but let's go to birds a little bit. You might have all the other things that everybody else has, or not, but little
people come to Shenango County to meet your future partner under the stars. What I think I would just say too, and you'll notice that across these, we talk about these things in terms of assets, but I think things that are assets can also be crumbling assets, or our definition of them may be shifting, and so we're defining things differently. So I would think of wetlands, for example, or marshes. We couldn't fill them in fast enough, right? We wanted them for farmland, where now it's really interesting. Not only are we saying that they have ecological value, but there's a lot of some programs worked with some folks that are west, and they've been looking at models where they're reestablishing wetlands and using them in an ecological way, not just for storage space. Or they've talked about how we used to have to develop huge pipes to transport and keep water clean, and they're actually using these directly. So it's how we do these things can depend on culture and human capital as well. So cultural capital.
Sorry,
go ahead.
The natural capital assets, that could you also include landmarks that are not necessarily natural man-made?
So that's where we would get into built capital.
Oh.
So that's just kind of that fine distinction, but I think you're absolutely right. Like we have that also define place too that make our places unique. And they can tie it closely, like the types of built capital may depend on that landscape is, so they're related. Okay? Make a distinction.
Yeah, I think.
Okay. How about cultural capital?
it has a community that people from all over town.
Okay. Cool.
To Rochester, that we have a really amazing farmers market, and it brings together people of all different ethnic backgrounds. We all get together.
So I think interesting about that is you're right. Lots of places have farmers market, but you argue that based on the place that you're at, there's certain things that you are grown based on the landscape in the greater Rochester area, and the cultures that are going to distinguish what you find at that farmers market. Yes. Versus any other place.
It's true. The farmers market in Rochester, there's a big urban population in Rochester. Here at the farmers market, we don't find sheep's heads and pigs and all those kinds of things. Those are just an abundance of the question.
So what's really exciting about that is when you think about some of these things, even though you may share them, I think they're still a marketing tool for our own regions because of that diversity. Like you could go across upstate New York in the summer, hopping across farmers markets and have a really neat, interesting experience in every one of those places. And I think I would argue you couldn't get bored if you're into those kind of things, even though it has a farmers market, but it goes back to that place, the culture. You know, it's a,
I think too, you're thinking about your community, and if you don't have a farmer's market, so the flip side is it's a really beautiful natural landscape, but we need to enjoy it in a way. What could you do to sort of bring people to it? You know, so how do you do that? If there's a market or a small one, how can it be beefed up and really bring in the community and then it becomes then it's capital because it helps build connections and helps financial capital and there's a lot of things. So.
Anything else that anybody wants to add to the cultural capital aspects that you say specifically? Do you have ethnic festivals or what kind Anyone add anything? I'm trying to remember that we Ohio. Oh, that's right. Okay. I was thinking Ohio, but any thoughts on that? Okay. A lot of the okay.
In Rochester had a really big number of Holocaust go and congregate there after moving to. So we actually have legacy in our community college whole program, a whole bunch of classes and programs based on Holocaust issues. There's more there at community college and there's student programs.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I guess that's a relatively market, maybe it is, but I'm thinking of having lived in upstate New York my whole life, and I've never known that Rochester is,
yeah, I mean, they've done some pretty big events in the past couple of years. A big annual conference that goes around the world that they had in community college last year, which kind of a big deal. Pretty widely publicized, a lot of community outreach based on that. Okay.
Human capital, what kinds of human capital do you have in your area? Leadership program, the community college, university. Go ahead. Okay. I'm certainly thinking of your host. There's a key in education is positive extension, right? More of an informal key, right? And that's the whole basis of the land grant system. So Cornell is here in part of it. That's what kind of they have questions. Yes.
I mean, here, suburban, bedroom communities that have very down and nobody talks to everybody. That.
Which is community, right?
But
I think
does everybody live in a sex place?
or island suburb. I guess you can say like it's a suburb of the home town. We have a pretty strong social aspect in the county. Like I said, there's in the case of the predominantly Jewish community, not Jewish, but the synagogue serve as a way for them to, even though it's impossible to do it on the week because at the time they usually
come and go.
The city of Innovators is one of the, I think there's a lot of platforms. Something just pulled you guys what's going on.
Really interesting to hear these things because I think one of the things you hear all the time is that there's nothing happening in upstate New York. There's opportunities, and yet just listening to what you guys are talking about, for those black parties or people that are in that way, could a cool place to be as a young person. So interesting. But Kelsey, did you raise your hand up at one point?
I mean, we also have like annual block parties, just like and like suburban. It's like a small town feel. Everybody knows everything else and what's going on.
Okay. Good. How about local capital? Can you bless things from on high, or have to influence regulations?
There's a lot of big projects that are considered as far as converting older buildings to apartments or
Yeah.
You're as a mayor, one another.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe other examples of people in the community. It could be politicians, but I mean, it could be elected officials, or it could be party leaders, so they may not actually hold a position, but they may be the Democratic Party, and you don't get past to get into a position to even run without kind of something like that. But that is something that's really interesting because I think we tend to think of people in power as our elected officials, and when we start to really get down into it, more to that. And I think you can use power, but if you have enough people behind you, you can get beyond the people who can power. How about, so we talked a little bit about financials. Does anybody want to add anything?
Yeah, so the Rice family is from Rochester, where we started. With opened like 12 stores last year, and they have huge, big investment.
I would say across lots of capitals, and I think of some of the stuff that Wegmans has done in terms of workforce development. They've certainly helped in terms of human capital assets as well.
Really good stuff for students who work for them for certain time.
The same example with Grace Shopper starting in Schenectady. The headquarters is right there, and they have a lot invested in
across all of the areas of change, different ways of doing things. Okay. How going back to built capital? Do you have some?
Well, some is not known for their time marks, but we do have some that could come interesting, such as you have the lighthouse, and people find that now. We also have that I think is the only one in the country. There's one in Switzerland, but it's something that I guess people might be interested in. Although, like, we have really good infrastructure, there's good probably strong things that someone else discovers.
I took my daughter to see Sweeney Stony Brook this week, and was thinking of you as I was seeing signs for Riverside, but I'm thinking, talking about the transportation system, really wishing we'd used public transportation as we found the highway for a long time. So.
International airport,
Okay.
very many international places,
But it's out there a little bit. Okay. That's a really, you guys will have to think about that as you're in some of these locations, because some of the regions, particularly for you, Kelsey, as we're about this, do include, so we define those by political boundaries, but our place is probably in these places. You know, we talked with ag development specialists in Crawford Extension, and so when you talk about their food shed, in terms of Canada, U.S., I think in terms of their food shed, which includes a lot across the border. So,
The capital, you know, there's other research on my house, my illustration, which actually goes through a lot of different capitals.
yeah.
one of the is University of Rochester Medical Center. It's a college teaching hospital. People come far out just to get treated there. Maybe oncology.
Good. Okay. I thought you were raising your hand. Was that cool to, one, think about your community maybe in ways that you hadn't thought of it before? Does this work make sense? Does that exercise kind of... Yeah. Talk about, so just a couple of key points related to that. I did mention earlier that about the capital framework, we typically think of rural because that's where the research is done, but I think it's relevant to other places. We emphasize that this is all place-based. And I think what's really important about that is that typical models, when you think about development, again, we talk about getting outside funding or drawing in outside resources, and it's typically been that we're thinking about what they need in their community, framed as we have this, and we don't have that, and we have to go elsewhere to get it. What's important about this place-based focus is what do we have? We don't have to get it from anybody else, and how can we build on the resources that we have to develop? And that puts things in a whole different light. It's very empowering because you're constantly looking for somebody else to come in and solve your problem, if that makes sense. The thing that they found in their research, again, is that investment in one capital can ultimately contribute to all of the other capitals that you can invest only in one capital, right? So we talked about it where you might link these capitals, and by linking those, I think you were giving an example of the racetrack. So if you're investing in the infrastructure piece, you might also be developing social capital. People come and hang out at the racetrack, and in the course of that, start talking about another way that they could address another community issue or something like that. So investment in one can strengthen all others, but you want to equally across them. So just get in one area that is unsustainable. But I think the big part about it is this idea that individual investments in each area leads to a synergistic effect, so you're getting more than what you're putting in it, which I think is really interesting. But again, just thinking about things in new ways. I love actually doing that exercise because every time I do, I think, oh, couldn't this be cool? And I also think sky is the limit in some of these. You know, who says that you can't make this connection to this connection? And I think that gets into kind of social entrepreneurship. You're spinning off ideas, and it can be very exciting. So, anything you want to add to that, Robin?
I think in this slide is when the one talking about. I think more next week too, but the big idea then is in your host community and looking at it. of the capital, right? And so it's not features of the community that you're going to identify. You want to identify the obvious ones. But it's sort of their ideal they want to attract more people like you to come and live there forever, right? Or for a good period. So things that aren't being highlighted, that they actually already have, or things that they sort of helping identify the that could come out. It's a very small farmers market that you know there's ethnic diversity, you know, and it's not really being represented in the farmers market, you know, things like that. So it's not going through what's obvious things that have already been highlighted. The tourism board has already identified, but from the way young, professional coming in, what would appeal to you, what are going to appeal to people like you, what could be highlighted, what's not going to be highlighted. If there's missing things that may actually that just need to be extracted.
Great. Well, yeah, what, again, because things get so familiar to us, so we think about how they can be attractive to some else we take them for granted. So how can we do that in new ways that we might help them think about it in a new way? Again, as Robin said, we're going to go into this in more detail next week in terms of specific activities. I think that's part that you guys are looking for our information on, and we'll get there. I wanted to just go through really quickly a couple more slides and then turn loose. And I was turn back, but because we're running our time to bring you back, I'm going to just run through planning a couple other things first, and then you can finish up by just going into by profile. So if you want more information, this first citation is what the handout that you have, which is, I think, from South Dakota Extension. It just gives a nice overview of the Community Capitals Framework. This summer, when we're looking at each one before each week, we're going to give you a two-pager that they've also produced on each of the individual capitals, which just summarizes what we talked about today, but they go into a little bit more detail, and I think it'll be helpful for you to have. The other thing is, when we talk about community development, this following up mapping community transformation with the Community Capitals Framework is just a nice way so you can see how the model has been put into work as a help people development. And then that example takes it one step further in that they've used the Community Capitals Framework to really identify some new development opportunities in a particular area. In fact, I think it's an island with some cool stuff. You don't have to do these, but I just wanted you to be aware of these in case you wanted to take this a little bit further and see how this model plays out in thinking of assets and community development. Okay, so we have talked a bit about this. What do you think of the Community Capitals Framework? Was it helpful? And we said, yes, help us in ways it might take a little bit more getting used to. And then what I would start to do is where Robin was going, and we'll do a bit of this next week, is using this framework to think about what you know about your communities and hosts so far. And start, just start. You're going to go into that in a lot more detail this summer, but it will be good just to start being thoughtful what we know. So, okay, this is what your portfolio should now contain. I'm calling this version 2, V2. It's going to do a little bit more, so by the time you leave here tonight, you will have beefed these up a little bit, so to speak. And again, just to keep in mind what we've got going. And one of the talking about your portfolio was leading into your week 8 presentation, and we wanted to get a little bit more specific about what we're thinking about for this. It's, again, a huge presentation. We're asking you all to keep it to 10 minutes, but what we to include is an introduction. And just so you know, I don't know if we've talked about this, and we're not sure it's going to happen, but we're hoping that some of the other administrative teams, some of our colleagues, can come here and helping us shape this. They've been really excited about being here, and we want them to give you guys an opportunity to talk to other than Heidi and Robin, right? So just you know, who are you, your class, your host, and your position. A host are you based on the host profile. Who are the hosts? Where are they located? What do they do? Your community view. What are some of the trends that you've noticed? What are some maybe place-specific characteristics? So that was some of that research that you did as well. Then your host community connections, some of the sites that you started to pull. So if you've been looking at these different profiles that we're putting together, look about some of these connections or the lack thereof or some of the assets. And then we want you to talk briefly about your learning action plan, which we'll be focusing on in a couple of weeks. What do you use in particular, hope to get, given all everything that we've talked about. And then just follow-up questions. So going forward, here's some of the things that I want to pay a little bit more attention to when I'm out in the community. So we're hoping that over the course of this, you through what hands-on work would need to do without a lot of extra. We're not asking this to be a polished presentation, but we're hoping, I think Robin put it really nicely as we talked about, of you know, we're hopefully putting you in good stead so that when you go out there, you're prepared forward and have a pretty understanding of what you're doing and what else you know and what else you want to do.
After that, in terms of the presentation, you're sitting down with someone who has no idea who you are, what you want to do this summer, and you're yourself, what you're going to be working for, what you're going to be doing, a little bit about community, the connections, and then you're going into the community project a little bit because it's talking about that connection of place and host a little bit. But it's basically helping you connect all the dots that have seemed somewhat not connecting throughout the weeks. I think they're pretty gelling, but hopefully by week 8, and you're telling stories, it's all going to come together. And it doesn't mean that you learn everything about the host, we're thinking about your community. No, this is just sort of the foundation, like I said. So,
and I just wanted to re-emphasize, you know, so we hope to discover or discuss these questions that we have intended for the forum in class. We think we've touched on them, but we think that this can kind of serve as a reminder, so we just put up what we've done so far on place as some of the things that you can decide before your presentation together. So if you're able to look and think about them, that shape what we put on. So that makes sense. We just wanted you to see the connection between those kind of. So in each session, when we put out those discussion questions, it's helping you be thoughtful about what were the key takeaways for today we'll get out of these, and then again, kind of synthesizing. I'm having a hell of a time talking tonight, and putting that all into presentations, and putting it all together. So far, just so you have them in one place, and then we just check in. But we can, if you want to check in after I shut up, you do 15 more words. The one thing that it occurred to me is we're saying that your files are posted up on the website, so you can go there to get them. I'm not sure it's supposed to be able to cut and paste if you wanted to throw it into something else to type, because I didn't think to say, you know, put that on your zip drive or anything tonight. But go ahead, you know, I would say spend the next 15 minutes.
is there anybody, you know, if you at some point want to go back and do more of the demographic profiles and you have headwaters, or you want to go to the source, send profiles on that, and I can help you with that too.
Cool. Questions as you're working through this stuff, and again, we're assuming that you're doing most of it here, but if you do go out and explore, want additional help, we're providing. I'll leave it play. Nothing else.
Bye.